Actually, the first speaker is Jan Plass, and he is at NYU, Steinhardt, I never Steinhardt School of Education, and Jan does Jan's work has been in multimedia, gaming technology for a while. So, without further ado, I'm just gonna let you talk.
Hi, good afternoon. First of all, now everybody is disappointed that Greg didn't go first, so my apologies. Yes, I know. Can't even try to imitate. But I would like to share some thoughts with you that I've had over the past years, I would say, on what could be summarized as adaptivity in learning, or as the foundation for the next generation of learning environments that are responsive to users' needs. And every time I hear people talk about adaptivity, had this nagging feeling that we don't really know what we're actually saying when we're using the term. And in fact, it became more nebulous than clear to me the more I thought about it. And what I do in situations like this is I develop some kind of conceptual models to explain it to myself. And got to a point where I thought it looked like something that could be shared with others so that I could get some feedback on that. And since this is a conference where we can actually talk with people, not just at people, I thought this is the perfect place to share this model, have some conversations about that, hopefully afterwards, and then hopefully improve it. So what I want to do is very briefly talk about approaches to adaptivity that existed, talk about adaptivity versus personalization versus customization, and then talk about this model that has been swirling around in my mind. So I want to distinguish customization as something where I can modify settings in a learning system and do that based on my preferences and optimize system acceptance, really. So I can set a particular option in the system based on what I prefer, and that makes me accept the system more by me saying, yeah, that allows me to make certain choices. The result, though, is usually relatively minor or surface modifications of the system. We can set some parameters, but that's about it. Personalization, which is often used in different ways, I'm going to use right now for the idea that as a learner, I can make certain selections of content or representations. And I can do that based on my learner preferences and or interests. So if I were to study statistics and I have a simulation that allows me to analyze a certain data set, I could have a data set that is meaningful to me that I use to analyze that. So personalization would be to bring in your own content into something that's already there. Personalization might also mean that I get a choice of 5 different or several different subject areas that I could use as a case study for a general concept. So what that does then is it optimizes relevance and motivation. But it would be the same learning path with different contents or skins. In contrast then, adaptivity to me would be that the system responds based on the learner's needs, and that the differences are based on, I call it diagnosed learner characteristics. I realize this is a point where it really gets stuck. And the goal is to optimize learning effectiveness in this particular case. And there would be a different learning path and learning content. And what that exactly means is what I really want to talk about. What is that different path and that different content? And I realize oh, there's the timer. Okay, good. So approaches to adaptivity that have existed and that we've been using, one of the older ones perhaps is adaptivity as attribute by treatment interaction or aptitude by treatment interaction, which is actually, when I was in grad school, was a big thing, or was just winding down being a big thing. But my mentor, Professor Leutner, who was one of the people who was working in this area, saw some strengths in that even when others were slaughtering it as an approach. And so the idea is to adapt specific instructional procedures and strategies to specific student characteristics. A lot of promise in that, and also a lot of problems with it, especially with the measurement of those characteristics. Another approach that we use in ITS is intelligent tutoring systems is the distinction between macro-adaptivity, where we talk about different goals, different tasks, different depth of content, different delivery systems, and micro-adaptivity, in which we actually micromanage the learner system or tutor 2D interactions, such as the mode that the task is getting or how it's represented, the scaffolds, etc. Finally, Valerie Schutz's model on her four-process adaptivity cycle puts this together in this kind of student and student model view of I capture the information, I analyze it, I select certain modes of representation, and then I present that to learner, and this becomes the cycle of the interaction and of the student modeling within that process. So there are a number of different models out there, but they all did not answer the question to me, so what is adaptivity then? We know about the process, we know about the goals, but how can I really do that in a systematic way? So as a conceptual model of types of adaptivity, so it almost became maybe the beginning of a typology, this is what I would like to propose. As key questions, we need to ask, what variables do we adapt for? Often that's assumed. Often people say I have an adaptive system. They don't even say what variable they adapt for. How do I measure this variable? And I realize here we're getting again into some very interesting areas that especially CREST has been making significant contributions to, and that really benefits from a strong measurement community. And then how to adapt in the end. How do we actually take all of the variables that we have decided to measure the expression and or the characteristic for a particular learner and then respond to that. So what are those possible variables? And I started making a table and it became quite unwieldy, but I'm going to separate those into different categories. There are cognitive variables. And typically when we talk about a system as being adaptive, we talk about current knowledge and possibly current skills. So the first two items. But there are other possibilities for being adaptive. I could look at the developmental level. I could look at language proficiency, so there's a lot of interest in limited English proficiency learners. I could look at learning strategies. I could look at cognitive abilities. I could look at self-regulation, or I could look at experienced cognitive load. And you see that if I structured this a little bit more, I could break it down as state variables versus trait variables. And I didn't, because now we could ask the question, well, we are working on a grant to look at executive functions as something that can actually be trained. So what we think of as a trait variable could actually become a state variable. So that's why I didn't group them to avoid the controversy. But we have certain variables that we either have to diagnose in real time or that we can every now and then assess in kind of a post-processing kind of way that we could respond to. But that's just on the cognitive side of things. We could go into motivational variables, individual interest in a particular subject matter, situational interest while I play or while I use a certain simulation game, website, goal orientation, going into goal orientation theory, mastery achievement orientation, theory of intelligence, self-efficacy, stereotype threat, persistence. All these variables I could make the basis for an adaptive system. Going the affective route, I say here emotional state, and that's why that column looks very short. If I listed all the interesting emotional state, it would be just as long as the other columns. Are learners angry, frustrated, bored, excited? What is their emotional state in terms of academic emotions, and how do we want to respond to that? And what is their ability to actually execute emotion regulation and deal with their own emotions? I may not have to respond to their emotional state as much if their emotion regulation is very high. And then social-cultural variables. And here it gets especially hard to measure that and respond to that. But what is the social context in which we operate? What is the cultural context in which you operate versus where the learners are coming from? And what are questions of identity and self-perception? A number of variables that we can look at for adaptive systems. And the first thing then that I would want to hear when somebody says, I have an adaptive system, is, well, which variables were you actually addressing? And the answer is 98% of the time probably current knowledge, current skills, but I still think we should say it. So then once I know the variables, I have to ask a couple of questions, and this comes from Konati. Is the variable relevant to achieve the system's pedagogical goals, educational outcome goals, general goals, values that we have as a society that we want the system to convey? Is there enough variability to justify the need for individualized instruction? It might just be a variable that doesn't really have different forms of expressions. Everybody is bored. Everybody has low prior knowledge. And if there is there sufficient knowledge on how to adapt the learner differences along this, for learner differences along this trait? And that becomes a really interesting research question. That's one that we've actually been working on in my lab for many years. What do we do if we know somebody has low executive functions, low self-regulation, or high self-regulation, et cetera? And there's a number of research studies that we and others, of course, have conducted that can flow into that. So once I have that, I can ask, of course, the question how to measure those variables, and I'm going to keep this very brief because there are several talks on this that we've heard today, starting from self-reports and surveys to games and apps that are just designed for the particular use of measuring these variables, to biometrics that we use for that, to learner analytics and user logs, etc. Data mining flows probably into this as well. So assuming we can, and I know that's a really big assumption, we can then ask the question, so how do I adapt and what do I do? And so when we look at, when we look at those items that I just described, we have a learning environment, some kind of learning environment, in which the learner exhibits some kind of learning performance. And then I can start assessing these different types of variables, obviously not all at once, but the ones that I'm interested in. And then I have some kind of an adaptivity model that flows back into my environment. And I really hope my next graphic doesn't also show up all at once. But let's see. OK, good. So now I want to explode that adaptivity model. I want to see what's in it. What do we really mean with adaptivity? So that was my question going in. And what we mean with adaptivity is, on the one hand, the core learning activity. I want to change the core learning that takes place adaptively, responding to the learner's needs. That's actually very hard and expensive. So what else could we do? Well, we can change the learner support around it. We can make that adaptive. I was very happy to hear that in many situations, the teacher actually gets the feedback and the teacher implements the support. You know, very strong way of doing that through learner support. The adaptive assessment, of course, is something that plays into that. But then we have also the preparation of learning. And here I see that, you know, there are many ways of looking at preparation of learning as something that can happen in an adaptive way. Even while we're in the learning system, I could say, well, you really should not be adjusting the system, but take this other prerequisite lesson or play this game to increase your executive functions, et cetera, to essentially be sent into the mode of you need to be better prepared for learning, and here's what we can offer for you to do that. And then finally, the cross-course progression. I used to call that something else, but then I realized cross-course was better than inter-course progression. Especially with my pronunciation. So the cross-course progression, that just in case you come across the other slides, the model has changed a bit since, is the final thing. So what do you do next? Where do you go from here? Or what sequence is actually the successful sequence for students with certain expressions of those variables that we're looking at? Now, let's look at those core learning activities. What can I do there? So drilling even further down, making more space for those, I can look at different scaffolds. I can look at different feedback, different guidance. I can look at different learning progressions within my system. I can look at different modes of representation. I can look at different learning mechanics. And these are just examples. There are probably dozens more that I could adapt for. But when I now look at a particular system, let's take smart sparrow simulations. The simulation itself doesn't change, but the feedback changes. So you can customize the feedback. When I look at an intelligent tutoring system, I see that the learning progression will change. The mechanic might not change. When I talk about learning mechanic, I mean the essential learning interaction. That's having spent too much time in games and thinking about that as a mechanic. So what is it that you do to learn? What is the interactive element that you execute to learn? So this is what you might, the progression, the mechanic, and the mode of representation together, you might say, is the content that changes. Even though scaffolds and feedback and guidance in a way are content as well. So that's why I'm not wanting to make this too big a deal. But now I can say my system is adaptive to somebody's prior knowledge or current knowledge by changing what, the progression, the scaffolds, and so on. So I have a language now that has helped me think about this in much more, with much more clarity. I could say I would like to address learners' boredom or learners' emotional state. I want to induce a positive emotional state by changing the mode of representation based on what emotions I measure in the learner. And we have done, for instance, research that we call research on emotional design, where I can show that if I change color and shape of certain objects, I can accomplish that without changing the content itself. So just the representation. So looking at another aspect of this five-part system of adaptivity, the preparation of learning, again, I can break this down into remedial learning, learning strategies training, language proficiency training, cognitive skills training, interest and motivation. Again, what are the factors that we say are factors to prepare learners to be successful in the actual learning process? Likewise, the learner support. What elements of learner support are there? Here are some examples. There's guidance, there's resources, and there's feedback that you can give in form of a dashboard, and we've already seen those dashboards. So this is really just my attempt to group those different types of adaptivity that we've seen into this model. It's a kind of typology, it's a kind of way of talking about it, but at the very least, I hope it'll give us some conceptual clarity to talk about adaptivity as something that doesn't have to be a very fuzzy term, but that can become a very concrete term. So the two examples I'm going to skip because I see a big zero here. They focus on how to design those mechanics based on different forms of current knowledge and on motivation. Happy to talk to you about that, and I'm going to pass it on to the next one.